Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck and I'm a pioneer today. Travel with me back to the early part of Oregon Territory. And we've got the historian here that can fill in the details. Welcome, Nita?
Leta.
And then you have three names, Leta.
Leta Lovelace Neiderheiser.
Well, we'll want to learn about each one of those, but I should have picked up the book, and here it says, you've written a new book.
I have.
How long did it take for you to put this together?
Well, I probably started doing the research about 9 years ago, seriously. I had certainly done a little bit, being a descendant of Jessie Applegate, a great-great-granddaughter. I have my whole life gone to Applegate reunions and heard tales about Jessie, and always thought, wow, it'd be interesting to do something with that. But the really serious research was started about 9 years ago.
So in this book, it's to Doug and Bernie. I went to one of your presentations at the Historic Society. I was fascinated. Shall we talk about how'd you get here? I mean, starting out, this might be the way that Jessie Applegate wrote the first.
Well, the book is very much based off of Jessie's letters. He was a prolific letter writer, and many of them have been saved. In fact, that was something I meant to bring and forgot. There's probably a couple of hundred of his letters that are still available in this, that, or Historical Society, buried back here, there, and everywhere. And that was part of the fun, is going into Douglas County Museum and the Knight's Library up at University of Oregon, and Historical Society in Portland, and over in Klamath Falls, and a lot of them back at Yale University, and down in Bancroft University down at Berkeley. A lot of his letters hidden away here, there, and everywhere. But this particular drawing you have, as I began to put the book together, my niece, Cynthia Howard, did some artwork for me, and that was she had hoped that would go on the very front of the book, kind of indicating the theme of the fact that it was based off of his writings.
Well, I should have brought a feather along, because we have turkeys, wild turkeys on our property. And that was the quill. Mm-hmm. The best quill came from wild turkey.
Oh, now that I didn't know.
And then there was a little inkwell.
And she shows and that inkwell there is actually drawn from one that I've inherited.
Oh, well, the first trip that the Applegate, who was on the trip?
Well, in 1843, which is the Oregon Trail, and if we have buried someplace here, and of course they started back in Missouri and came. This is the Oregon Trail, and that's how they came in 1843. Actually, there had not been any, or there were a few American citizens out here, certainly, but as you're probably well aware, in 1812, the Oregon Territory, after the war between Great Britain and the United States, was declared as neutral territory. Neither Great Britain or the United States had sovereignty over it, so it was to be under joint occupation. And it
was known as what?
It was just under joint occupation. It was neither U.S. territory or British territory.
But it had a name?
Just the Oregon Territory.
It was Oregon.
It was called the Oregon Territory, yes.
Okay.
But anyway, back in 1843, there had been a Great Depression along the frontier, well, across all of the United States, but certainly along the frontier, and that would have been Missouri, Iowa, that part of the country. There was a Great Depression. And from time immemorial, the Americans, from the time they arrived here on the Mayflower, when things got a little hard, they looked to whatever the newest frontier was.
Go west, young man.
Go west, young man. And so certainly as time in 1843, as they're coming out of this Great Depression, and there had been a number of, Lynn and Benton were two senators from Missouri who had put a bill in that said that anybody who went out to the Oregon Territory could receive 640 acres. It didn't pass then, but it was presented, and with that, we're trying to get away from the Depression and everything. People began to decide to go west, and they started back in St. Joe or St. Louis. Now, yeah, this says the Applegate Trail, and that we'll talk about in a little bit, but the red line is the Oregon Trail, and that's how the Applegates came in 1843. Jesse, his brother Lindsay, and his brother Charles and their families all came in 1843. Jesse, as he started out, he certainly was not the wagon master. It was a very large train, probably a little over 1,000 people.
Oh my.
And when they started out, he was not the wagon master, but the Applegates had a large number of loose cattle along with a few other people, and they didn't get out very far. And Peter Burnett, who was later the first governor of California, was the wagon master. But a great dispute came because the people who didn't have cattle didn't want to have to watch at night and do the guard duty. So the train split, and at that point, Jesse became captain of what was known as the cow column.
The cow column,
because they had all these loose cattle.
Oh my goodness.
And everybody assumed that the cow column would travel quite a bit slower.
Sure.
But in reality, it didn't. They were seldom more than a couple of days behind the light column, or the ones that didn't have the loose cattle. And in fact, I found documentation that fairly frequently they were actually ahead. Because Jesse was kind of a taskmaster. He had set up a very stringent set of rules. One of them was everybody's up at 4 in the morning. The wagons rolled at 7 a.m. sharp, and he rotated the wagons as to who would be in the lead today, and then that person would be in the rear the next day because you ate everybody's dirt in doing so. And if you weren't ready at 7 o'clock a.m., the fact that you went to the rear regardless. And so people became pretty, they marched to the drum. They didn't want to be in.
No, who'd want to eat all that dust?
And they really didn't have a lot of problems coming. And then, of course, part of what later leads to the Applegate Trail is in 43, when they arrived, you had to go to Fort Walla Walla and to the Columbia River, which is the far northeastern corner of Oregon there, and come down the Columbia River on boats.
Now, where did the boats come from?
They did have a few boats there, but the Applegates, along with many other people, there was lots of driftwood from, the Columbia flooding yearly and things. There were driftwood on the beaches, and they simply made their boats. Some of them took their wagons and tore the wagons apart and made boats out of that, or some of them didn't tear them apart too much. They just caulked them and basically made them water worthy and floated them down the river. But for the most part, they did make dugouts, sort of, or rafts, I guess is a better word.
Now, we are talking, this is the train on its way west.
Okay, yeah, but that's Applegate Trail, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, because that's not the Oregon Trail.
Oh, I get the two mixed up.
Yeah.
We're talking the Oregon Trail
Well,
here.
the book deals with Jesse's entire life, so it starts back for when he was just a child. The Oregon Trail is his first introduction to Oregon, and then the Applegate Trail comes about in 1846. And that's about halfway through the book.
Well, the book itself is fascinating, and I want everybody to know, where's it available? Is it available?
It is available locally at either Josephine Historical Society or Oregon Books. If you're up in Douglas County, it's available at the Douglas County Museum.
Oh, wonderful. Now,
or you can go online and get it through Amazon.com as either a Kindle download or just simply order the book.
well, now these pictures show the trail, but they're all different colors.
Okay, well, this actually is back to when the book was being published. The publisher sent me these three choices as to what to pick as the cover. And so I picked this cover because it does show the old letters and the map and then the compass, because Jesse Applegate was a surveyor, and he makes his living in the early part of the book in Missouri as a surveyor, and then certainly after he came to Oregon. A great deal of Oregon's original surveying was done by Jesse Applegate.
So he had a profession besides an ambition to come west.
So anyway, in the end, that's the one I picked. And I didn't pick this one. In part, I kind of liked this, but the wagon that it shows here is pulled by mules. And anybody who knows about the Oregon Trail would have known that wagon was a freight wagon. That was not an Oregon Trail wagon that's pictured here. And any true Oregon Trail historian would go, why did they use that?
Well, no wonder you didn't choose that one. Now, because mules were used.
A few people on the Oregon Trail might have had mules, but it was certainly not. They were used on much shorter distance and for freight wagons, not for long hauls.
Okay, but now this wagon, and this is a horseback here. Mm-hmm. This wagon was used in a later time?
Oh, they certainly, in 1843, the wagons, they still were coming west in wagons up to the early till the railroads came. And actually, there are some people that came west in wagons clear up to the Dust Bowl days.
I have heard about coming over the Siskiyou Mountains in a wagon, and that's during car time, but people that didn't all have cars.
Cars, yeah.
And if they had cars, they had to turn them around to get up the Siskiyou summit. But early days, Jesse, I mean, you have every right to be a little proud of this ancestry. You've made presentations to school kids, to senior citizens.
I have. Jesse was an extremely interesting man, and he was a pioneer in the sense that he led the pioneers in 1843 west. He certainly, and this is
the guy.
That's Jesse Applegate. It's a drawing rather than a picture. He would never allow a picture to be taken. He thought he was a homely man, and he didn't want anybody to have to look at him after he was gone in particular. So this was drawn by his nephew, Buck Applegate. There's several different times over the course of Oregon's history that they tried to get a picture of him taken to include in different early Oregon history path, and he never would allow it.
Oh, well, it sounds like he had a real stubborn...
I think he did in many ways.
Well, it'd have to be to do all that he did. You have favorite stories about the man?
Well, certainly there are many, but after he arrived in Oregon in 1843, Oregon, of course, wasn't a territory yet. It certainly wasn't a state, but they had formed a government to try and rule things out here, and particularly once the legislation had been introduced to allow the 640 acres if you came west. The people that were already here were real concerned about that the newcomers would come, and they were living on land, but they had never had any way of recording that they owned this piece of land, and they were real concerned with all the new influx of people that people would claim their land or whatever. So they formed a little government. It was a three-headed government. They didn't have one like a governor or anything. It was like a committee government almost. And there were several things about that government that Jesse didn't like. In part, they had granted the right for the Methodist Church and the Catholic Church to own mile square sections of the land, and the citizens didn't really like that either. But anyway, after Jesse came, and there's a lot more Americans out here, it became evident that they needed to do a little different, reform the government a little bit. And the first Peter Burnett was with a group that did rewrite the government, but they never introduced it to the citizens to vote on. They simply wrote it and kind of, this is what is. And Jesse was very upset about that. He very much believed that it was every man's right to vote on what, and he later writes a lot about that. And he believed early on that women should vote, that colors should vote. And if you were old enough to be conscripted into the Army, and back then, well, his grandfather had gone into the Army at 14. But if you served on the Army, you should be able to vote.
Oh.
Was one of the things he pushed heavily. But anyway, in 45, he rewrote Oregon's government, what was governing them. And up until that time, they had tried to support their government by saying that taxes was a voluntary thing to support your government. Well, he later makes a comment that, no, I can't write this moment, but something about a frog would no more do that than, but that it just didn't work. So when he rewrote and he did it pretty much single-handedly. And another thing that he did, the British had never supported this original little government that has formed. Of course, the British is pretty much as much of an influence as the Americans at this time.
Sure.
And they had not been willing to join into this governing body. But Jesse, once he came onto the scene, convinced the British that they needed to be a part of it and that they needed to pay taxes to support it. And everybody else said, yeah, that's impossible. They're never going to agree to this. But he convinced them to do so. And when he rewrote the whole government system, and then it had a governor, and George Abernathy became the first governor. But the other thing that Jesse insisted on when he did that was that he wrote it all out by hand. Of course, they didn't have printing anything.
Or typewriters.
Typewriters or anything. And he did enough copies that every single place that voted, every voting place, and there weren't lots of them, had a copy of the one that had been done before that never was presented to them to vote on, his new one, and they were read aloud at every voting poll so that people could then knew what they were voting on.
Because a lot of these pioneers didn't read.
They didn't. And that, again, that was something Jesse was adamant about, that every school was extremely important. That's the first thing he did when he came to Oregon, was form a school in his little area, and then later in 49 when he moves down to the Yoncalla, Oregon, Yoncalla area, that's the very first thing he does, is establish a school.
Well, now, where was that first school, the first place that he settled?
It was called Rickreall. It's kind of by what's Dallas now.
In that valley that's so fertile, west of Salem.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful country in there, and very, the names of the towns are, I know Amity, and no, Amity's over there. Some of these beautiful names of towns, they must have had, well, Mennonite influence, or what do you?
I'm not aware of that, if they did. Well, yeah, actually a little later they did.
Because I've been to some of their things, and it's fascinating. I mean, the school that they have there, and just out of Corvallis is how we happened to drive by, and I was very impressed.
Now, it was very fertile, and Jesse and his brothers established farms and a little grist mill, and fairly quick, within a year or so, Jesse was the third wealthiest person in Oregon. But he ends up not wanting to stay there after he lays out the Applegate Trail in 1846. And that came about because when Polk became president, he issued a proclamation that at all costs, the Oregon Territory would become a part of the United States. And the British were kind of going, now wait a minute, we have a very productive fur business out there. We're not going to walk away from this. So they sent a warship to set at the mouth of the Columbia, sent spies in to kind of look things over, and the Oregonians became very aware that they were doing this, and they were afraid that we were going to go to war. And they realized that we had no standing army out here, none whatsoever, and the only way to get an army in was to come from Fort Hall, which is now Pocatello, Idaho. From there west, you were coming by British-controlled forts, so there would be no way to get an army in if we went to war, no way to get ammunition, whatever, supplies, and no way to get women and children out of harm's way. And many of the people that were here realized, they had fathers or grandfathers that had fought in the Revolutionary War and understood how the British had used the Indians against the colonists and were afraid that would happen here. So they realized they needed a way to get soldiers in, supplies, and their families out of harm's way. So the governor, Abernathy, advertised in the paper looking for someone to look for a southern route.
Oh, this is...
And at that point...
Because the British wouldn't
have control of a southern way.
But they had the Columbia River tied up.
They had the Columbia River tied up, and like I said, clear from Fort Hall, Idaho on was all British-controlled forts.
So we're talking
from clear back here.
Okay.
All of this way they had control of.
Okay. So, and Jesse was a smart man.
Now to start with, when the governor advertised at first, the Applegate, Jesse and Lindsay did not step forward. There was another group led by a Colonel Cornelius that started out to look for a southern route. Didn't get too terribly far, probably down to about the area where Sutherland, Oregon is now. Of course, they're coming from north, up at the Dalles, that area, or Dallas, that Rick Rial, Salem area, coming down. And they get down to about the Sutherland area, and he, for whatever reason, I guess they were having a hard time. He just gives up, turns around and goes home. And the rest of the group, there were 15 of them in all, went a little bit further, but then they too give up. And Levi Scott later would write that they discovered that an expedition without a leader simply didn't work. And every expedition needed a leader to succeed. So they all go back and kind of give up on it, but Levi Scott let it be known at that time that if another group should come to look for us, he wanted to be a part of it. And at this point, Jesse and Lindsay stepped forward because they realized how important it is, and they hadn't the first time, because between the three Applegate brothers, they had 24 children under the age of 14. A war might be coming, and they felt they needed to be at home to protect their
family.
And they, just the idea, they haven't been here all that long, and going off and leaving their families for 4, 5, 6 months to look for this new way in.
To look for a way.
Yeah, there was no trail at all, so they had to explore and locate a way that could support wagons. They had to have water every 15 miles about.
How do you get water going across?
Your trail had to go to places where there were streams or whatever. Often it was maybe a spring, but that was part of the criteria. You can't bring people and the 15 miles would have been an average day's travel.
Canteens weren't a part of it.
You can't carry a canteen to feed your animals.
And animals, he knew they had to bring animals.
Well, you got to have the animals to pull the wagons, if nothing else. And most everybody had a milk cow and a horse or two. And
so early in the morning, between the time of wake up, I jumped ahead, when the wagon train is coming, it had to have time to milk the cow.
Oh, absolutely. And
fix breakfast.
And I didn't bring that along, but they often they milked the cow and they made their butter for the day by hanging a bucket of some kind either under the wagon, and it juggled as the day went on and made the butter. And later they became a little smarter and hung it inside upon the bow of the wagon, and again, but at least it wasn't getting all the dust from below the...
Oh, well, I'm fascinated by women's survival mode, and so I want you to come back and tell us a little more about that. Men and wagons and all the work that went into Jesse becoming What was the first thing? Here he is,
Rickrial.
Oh, I'm glad you can say it. And they went from there where?
Well, after he lays out the Applegate Trail, and they bring that first group back over it in 46. It's too bad I didn't have a little time to talk about that, but they had a great deal of difficulty, that first group coming back. Got caught up at Canyon Creek Canyon, where Canyonville is now. But looking at that now, you don't think that was a very difficult canyon, but it was extremely narrow and long. And one of my pictures here kind of, well, maybe it doesn't.
And this was the second time?
This is one of the pictures that kind of shows what that canyon looked like then. And as they were coming through there, that first group, that first year, they got caught in a terrible storm just as they were going into this canyon. Truthfully, not a very good road had been built through it, or any road at all. Levi Scott and his group, as they came with the wagons, kind of had to build the road, and the road was dependent that there not be, because you were going pretty much down the creek bed through there, and it's about 10 miles long, and it was dependent that the creek stay in its bed. Well, the worst storm in West Coast history started about the second day they were into that canyon. It was the same storm that caught the Donner Party down in California in the mountains.
So we know what devastation the Donner Party had, and so the rest could be a disastrous story, and you wouldn't be here to tell it.
Well, it proved to be a pretty disastrous story for quite a few people.
Well, I'm going to invite you back because I want to know more about how did these women folks survive, and how this comes down to you and your family. Thank you so much for being my guest today, and it's wonderful to look at these wagons and these things that were part of Pioneer Story. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to hunt for history, and this has been one of my joys to find out early Oregon territory. Did I use the right term?
To start with, it became, in the process, it became a territory, and then it became a state, of course, in 59.
Thank you so much, Nita, for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.